Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and special salam to Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani. And for those of you that you've been in our previous sessions, you know that the moderator of the sessions is Amani Al-Khatatiba. But today, due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, Amani was not able to participate, so he has been involved into a Gaza benefit event and unfortunately will not be able to join the session of today. But she has sent me a video message, and with your permission, I'm going to just play it. It's 2 minutes, and then we will start the session. So, do you see the screen? Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is your host for our Islamic Feminism course, Amani, and I am heartbroken that I will not be able to join you all for our last lecture of this entire series, but I have been called away for a benefit event for Gaza today in London. And I'm sure that you can all understand how this is deeply connected to everything that we've been talking about together this week. So I really, really am so proud of everyone for the discussions that this course has inspired, for the energy and the dedication and the curiosity that everyone has brought to our discussions. And I hope that you feel as moved and transformed by this week as I have been, alhamdulillah. Of course, I would love to invite you all to ensure that this is not the last time that we connect at all. Maybe it was the first for some of us, but surely not the last, inshallah. So please make sure to follow us on Muslim Girl on all social media. And you can go on muslimgirl.com and sign up for our newsletter if you want to drop your email so that you can be the first to receive the clips from this course when they become available, inshallah. I am sure you all agree with me that it has been such a powerful experience, not just with the knowledge that we've shared together, but also in the collective energy that we're all engaged in, of reclaiming our narrative and honoring our intellectual heritage and the lineage of all of the incredible Islamic and Muslim feminists whose footsteps we walk in, alhamdulillah. And I'm so excited to see the direction that you will continue this legacy in, inshallah. And with that being said, it's only fitting that we close out with someone whose work embodies exactly this spirit, and that is Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani, who is a leading voice in reimagining the future of Islamic feminism, which is what today is all about. Her research on gender justice, family law reform, and Quranic hermeneutics in transnational Muslim contexts offers a roadmap for what comes next for all of us. And it goes beyond the academy, it goes beyond theory, and it goes straight into transformation, inshallah. I know that this lecture is going to move all of us, and I'm so grateful to her for closing out this journey for us on such a special occasion. So please give her your full engagement and curiosity, and know that I am cheering you on wherever this knowledge takes you. So with peace, love, and solidarity, it's your girl, Amani, signing out. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, with this introduction, I would like to invite Dr. Al-Sharmani to start the session of today. Dr. Al-Sharmani, the stage is yours. Please go on.
Thank you so much. Everybody, can you hear me well? I don't have a mic, but excellent. Thank you. So I want to say good evening. I mean, some of you are evenings already. Good morning, wherever you are. Wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to extend first my thanks to Sadra International Institute for inviting me to be part of this course. I'm also privileged that I was part of the colleagues that you shared the journey with the last few days. They are very esteemed and close colleagues and friends of mine, and whose work I highly value and cite. So I'm glad to be in their company as well. So what I have in mind tonight for you is, of course, I was given the title, what is the future of Islamic feminism? It's kind of like, you know, where do we go from here? So it will be in that direction. But first, I would like to take you with me on my understanding of what it is Islamic feminism. I think, of course, this has been talked about, researched, discussed for now almost since the early 90s, you know, so several decades. But I think it's still an important question so that we're all on the same path. But before I start that, I want to ask you a question. And maybe some of you can share, not everybody. So you've had like 5 days, I believe, of discussing different aspects of Islamic feminism. Is what intrigues you so far, or what maybe infuriates you or excites you, or, you know, puzzles you? Can you share, one of you or two of you? So that's my first question, based on what you've heard, based also perhaps of what you've read, because I understand some of you are researchers, some of you are activists, some of you are both, right? So what has intrigued you thus far, maybe, or infuriates you, or excites you, or puzzles you? So that's my first question. If a couple of you can share quickly. And number two, I didn't share readings. I'll share that afterwards. But I gave, you know, I shared like a little task. So if also a couple of you can share quickly, what did you think of that task? You know, what were your takeaways? So the idea was that you read some verses by themselves individually and then read it in its unit. What was your takeaway? So perhaps if I can hear from you, that would be great. First, before I start. Anybody? Tamara, please go ahead.
I'll say what astounded me, I wouldn't say infuriated me, because I think it's inevitable, is the systematic bias in traditional scholarship, especially because these are the individuals that we have to base our understanding on to some extent. Yeah, it's just incredible to see how unreflected it's been to some extent.
Thank you. Anybody else? Can be also something that still puzzles you. Or you can share your thoughts about the task, if you've had a chance or some time to do it. Anybody? Okay, I take it that you just want to mull over it, to discuss, think about it a little bit. And okay, so that's fine with me as well. The way I'll do this is that I will present PowerPoint, and please, I invite you at any time during my presentation, just interject, and I will leave some time. My colleague here will keep me on my toes as well, so that I don't talk for the 2 hours, of course. I don't mean to do that. I won't. I want to hear from you. It should be an interactive and a discussion. But also during my presentation, if there's something that you want to say, clarification question, or some comment that you want to share, just jump in. Okay? And then I will leave some time, hopefully maybe an hour or a little more, for discussion. And I will share now. I think it's this one. Yes. Can everybody see? Let me just start from the beginning. Can you see? I haven't done the slideshow yet, because I'd like to see you too. But if you can manage, or this is not the slideshow format or the reading format, but if you can manage, is it okay? Maybe I should put this a little bit up. Although I wanted to see you actually. Yeah. Can you see? Can I get some feedback if you can see? Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can
perfect.
see.
Excellent. So I'm not going to do the slideshow, but if you feel like you need to see more, please let me know, and I will count on you, Mahmoud, to let me know if any of my colleagues, the participants, are having any issues. So the term, as you can see, the title, it's the now and the future. So I will try to do my best also to fulfill the task that I've been given, like where do we take it from here? But also tell you a little bit first, what is Islamic feminism? Because certainly there are different iterations of Islamic feminism. So I think I need to first explain where do I come? How do I investigate it? How do I understand it? Yeah. And I locate it first within what I do in my research. So I research Islamic text, and by Islamic text specifically, Islamic law, family law, i.e. classic pre-modern fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, and its relationship to modern family laws, right? Also the Quran and the tafsir, exegesis, and also sometimes, but again, the focus being, my entry point is the gender question, right? Now, but this is related to the second point. I am interested in these texts. I study them systematically, carefully, right? But another aspect of my question, my driving question in my work is, what do Muslim women do with these texts? What do they do with them? Why do they come to them? What questions do they bring to them? And how do they engage with them? Now, which women? Muslim women are not monolithic by any means. So in my work, I've been focusing on two groups of women: scholars, academics, some of them based in North America, in UK, and some of them based in the MENA region, in Southeast Asia. Some of them write in English and French, and some of them write only in Arabic, right? And I don't study everybody women scholars who do that, but I've selected some of them, and I had a rationale for that, right? Which I hope to explain. But another group of women that are very relevant for me that I study are just not scholars, regular women, you know. I don't want to use that word regular. It doesn't mean the scholars are not, like extraordinary, but like, so they don't work on scholarship. They might be teachers, engineers, but both groups are Muslim women. And these women, I've been focusing particularly on Egypt and Finland. And my entry point is the gender question. How has religious patriarchy been constructed? How is it deconstructed? How do certain patriarchal interpretations been formed? Are there alternative interpretations, right? Both textually and lived, so like I'm also interested in how this tradition informs and is informed by the life experiences of the women that I work with in Egypt and Finland, right? Hence, you could say I'm interested in not only textual Islam, but also lived Islam. And more importantly, I am interested in the connection between them, focusing on the question of gender. So my approach, the methodology that I use, the work I do is textual, but also ethnographic. I've also been trained as an anthropologist. So I go out and attend what these women are doing, participate, do a lot of interviews, life history interviews, and so on, right? This is my most recent book that kind of like captures a lot of work that I've been doing on this area. And it came out at the end of 2024. And I'm happy to share with you some of the chapters that will inform what I will say. So basically tonight, and anytime that I'm speaking too fast or my voice is low, please let me know. So I'm hoping to share with you what is Islamic feminism as a field of inquiry? How can we locate it within Islamic studies, first and foremost, and towards the end of my talk, within gender and religious studies, even if people who are not working on Islam. But I'm also interested, I'll tell you a little bit about, because the kind of Islamic feminism that I work with, it has these two components. They are intertwined. It's social engagements, or sometimes what we call activism and scholarship. So the first two parts are the now. So how I understand, and I have been researching and working on Islamic feminism. And then the last part that I will share with you is where do we go from here? What's the future of it? And what I'll try to do is actually, as I present, I hope I'll explicate in what way also what's happening now in the kind of Islamic feminism that I research. What are the directions for the future, right? Okay. The way I understand, sometimes in some scholarships, this term, of course, it's contested. There are those who say and have written about it. How can the two be compatible? What is feminism and Islam? There are some scholars who do scholarship that can be termed Islamic feminist, but are very much against calling themselves Islamic feminist, right? But I use it not as an identity marker. I use it as first and foremost as an analytical category, right? And the way I understand it, so I'm not interested in any kinds of Muslim feminism. I'm interested in a particular kind that includes these two components and in an intertwined way. Knowledge being produced, driven by the question of gender inequality and gender justice, but where that question becomes an entry into conversations about theology, ethics, and law, with gender still being the central point, but theology and ethics and law very much being present, right? And the second component of is that knowledge is not just produced for the sake of knowledge. It's a scholarly knowledge, it's academic, it's published in peer-reviewed journals. The people who are doing it are academics and so on, but also they are scholar activists. So this knowledge is used to bring about change on the ground. And very specific example is reforming Muslim family laws in Muslim majority contexts that are drawn from classical fiqh, but in a hybrid way. It doesn't exactly equal to fiqh, of course, Islamic jurisprudence, that is. So that, and also like bringing in new religious discourse in the religious domain, right? So that's how I understand it. And because I'm using it as an analytical category, I want to be clear about what is, for me, what is the Islamic about it and what is the feminism about it. So the Islamic, so therefore, for example, some of the scholars that I study, even though they don't call themselves as an identity marker Islamic feminist scholar, I call them Islamic feminism scholar because I'm using it as an analytical category. And the way I'm understanding it, Islamic about it is because these scholar activists and the women, some of the just lay women that I'll share with you, some of their experiences, are really closely engaging with Islamic texts, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Islamic jurisprudence, whether it's usul al-fiqh, right? So that's the Islamic part about it. And number two, they locate their work within an Islamic thought, right? They are critically engaging with it, but they locate it within that thought. They see it as part of that thought, although being critical, right? And they do not shy away from a faith-based position. They do not shy away from being explicit about being Muslims and being explicit about this tradition meaning something for them, and also wanting this knowledge to transform. Now, the feminism about it, of course, number three, which we all know, it's the issue, it's the goal to use this knowledge to address gender inequalities in laws, in social, religious norms, in the different domains where religion is used to justify inequality against, based on gender. Yeah, that's part of it. But also, for me, it's feminism, and I hope to show it to you through my examples, and by all means, please ask me in the discussion, because it's also an epistemological framework. They use feminist epistemological framework where they are trying certain feminist methodologies as well as theories of knowledge, where they try to trace, for example, how certain concepts become authoritative, how certain interpretations become the norm, right? That comes from feminists as an academic inquiry, which is important, which is relevant, which is useful. And they are bringing that to here. So for me, that's what's feminism about it, the methodology and the epistemology, as well as it's, of course, being a social justice thing. And the people I study, you know, and of course, they're not all the same, but I study them in an integrated way. I bring them into conversation with one another, right? And what I argue is that, broadly speaking, when you look at the Islamic feminism as an, you know, as a hermeneutical scholarship, as a kind of academic work that tries to reread Islamic text, it's broadly speaking trying to do two things, broadly speaking: hermeneutics of deconstruction and hermeneutics of reconstruction. And I think if we want to study Islamic feminism much more systematically and also critically, you know, and also point out its gaps, you know, for example, how what is produced in Arabic or Urdu or Farsi, is it equivalent to English, or is English dominating? There are a lot of gaps that we should talk about and challenges. But I think it's also important to study systematically what are these interpretive approaches that they are using, and to bring in an integrated way, right? So in terms of the deconstruction, what I've noticed in studying over many years these different scholar activists is that trying to trace really how certain dominant concepts have become concepts, normative concept, not just the concept. So a term, I'll give you an example from the term of qawamun, which becomes qiwama from verse Surah An-Nisa, verse 434, how from a term it becomes a concept that is again a norm, that is a patriarchal norm, right? So that's one part of their deconstruction. The other part is also really looking very systematically at the methodologies used by jurists and by exegists, and you know, unpacking them critically. Okay, this methodology, what are its underlying premises? What are its how is it being applicable? Are they applying it systematically, even using their own methodology and logic as well? So that's the hermeneutics of deconstruction. But I think the contribution of Islamic feminism is also, at least the ones that I study very carefully, is that it does not stop at the stage of critique, you know, telling us, okay, how did these patriarchal interpretations come about, you know, and methodologically, conceptually, but they're also reconstructing. So in what way? Again, I divide it into two things, that I'm interested in this hermeneutic of a reconstruction through it, although they are driven and they are focusing on the question of gender. What do we learn from it about larger theological questions? For example, Tawheed, like in the work of Amina Wadud, how does it illuminate us, help us understand Tawheed in a nuanced and richer way? What does it mean when she says in her work it's a social praxis? What does it mean? Right? Tawheed, which is so essential to Islamic creed, aqidah, right? Monotheism. Also ethical questions, like, you know, how they focus on the ethical concepts in the Quran: ma'ruf, ihsan, fadl, magnanimity, ihsan, goodness and beauty, ma'ruf, what is known to be good, you know, systematically. So what do we learn through this hermeneutic of a reconstruction about ethics, whether it's Quranic ethics, about theology, about the nature of the divine, about the human mandate? So that's part of it. And also, what are they offering in terms of alternative readings to the so-called gender verses, whether it's the ones about polygyny, whether it's the one about wife beating, right? And I want to stress that it doesn't mean they've covered it. All the answers have been answered, and it doesn't mean that everybody are doing this in an even way, right? So this is an ongoing work, right? Okay, I'll give you an example, and please, by all means, any minute you want to jump in, say something, ask a question, do so. Okay, I'll give you an example. One context that I'm very familiar with and I do a lot of work with is Egypt. So in 2001, maybe some of you are familiar with this law and this event, you know, these historical processes. So the Egyptian legislature legislated a procedural family law, and in it was an article that said women can petition for judicial khula, right? That's a non-fault divorce, where the woman says, you know, she doesn't have to prove any prejudice. She doesn't have to prove to the court that the husband harmed her in any way. She just wants out. And in exchange, she forfeits, she gives up the dower, mahr, as well as the post-divorce financial dues, whether it's like the mut'a, the compensation, or the idda, the nafaqa, the maintenance that she would get during the waiting period, right? And this is a divorce that comes from classical Islamic jurisprudence based on a certain hadith in the prophetic sunnah, based also on an interpretation in Surah Al-Baqarah, right? But most jurists assumed, whether they are Sunnis or Shias, that this is a whole divorce that the wife will negotiate with the husband. So they assume the husband will consent. That, and usually that's how it's written about in the fiqh books. But what the Egyptian legislature did was, nope, we don't need the husband's consent. It's completely irrelevant. The woman comes to the court, she petitions for that law, for the khula. As long as she gives up the dower, she goes through the procedural requirements, she gets it, it's automatic. There were a lot of uproar against this law, and some of the critics of it use that term. It contravenes the husband's qiwama. That word was repeated over and over by some religious scholars, by the public sphere, the debates. And qiwama was understood as divinely given to the husband, and as understood not simply a husband's duty to provide for the wife and the children, but more like a male authority, and that somehow justifies his right to unilateral repudiation, to have the upper hand in ending the union, the marital union, rather than a woman more or less having a an equal right, right? So, and there were, for example, this cartoon, which was published in one of the books published by my colleague, a Dutch scholar who studied it also. And you can see here, and I translated it from Arabic, she is saying, and you can see the husband is dwarfed. So the assumption is the woman has become much more powerful than the husband, right? And things have been turned upside down. She has now the authority, and she's going to threaten him. If you go out, I'm going to divorce you by khul 3 times, right? Okay, so the question is, people all the time were saying, oh, this is against qiwama. Qiwama understood implicitly and explicitly as male authority, but also as a justification for husbands having higher or more of an access to divorce than women. So the question is, how did that understanding of qiwama come about? And this is where I give you an example of what Islamic feminism scholars do, what their work can tell us. So someone like Umayma Abu Bakr, who's a professor at Cairo University and one of the key Islamic feminism scholar activists in Egypt. She also is active transnationally, but also very much in Egypt. So she did this very important study where she studied how, that verse where the word qawwamun, which means protectors, caretakers, some people translate it into in charge of, and it's in Surah An-Nisa, verse 34, right? And said, men are qawwamun over women, so it's an adjectival noun, with what God has, favored some over others, and with what has God given them. So what she does is that, okay, she looks at that word qawwamun, right? Then it becomes a noun, qiwama. Over 10 centuries of exegetical works, tafsir, which is very important in our Islamic interpretive tradition, starting from the classic one, At-Tabari, 9th century, all the way to Muhammad Abdu. How did they interpret that word qawwamun, right? So, and this is an example of hermeneutics of deconstruction, how it was a term, qawwamun, right? Describes men being providers of women. How did it become a patriarchal concept, right? And so what she does is that, and she said the different stages in which the term becomes a concept and layers of patriarchal meanings are added to it. So Tabari, turns it into Ahl Qiyam. So men are Ahl Qiyam. He interprets this as an authority, right? but he links it to men's role to provide. Then we come to the second stage with Az-Zamakhshari, Al-Razi, and Qurtubi. And then it becomes male superiority, and it starts taking on these meanings. These exegetes, mufassirin, human beings, are adding to it, not in the text, that men are superior and giving justifications. Men lead the prayer, men join to jihad, men ride horses, right? Some of them also using some pseudo-scientific arguments, right? And then we come to a third stage with Ibn Kathir and Suyuti a bit later in the centuries. Then they start doing what we call tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, which normally is something that is used to arrive at a holistic meaning of the Quran, and our scholars before used it. But here, what they do is that actually they use it to cement and to reinforce qiwama as a patriarchal concept. So they link it to another verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, which talks about procedures and measures for divorce. And then it says men have daraja, a degree over women. But they take that word daraja, they take it out of context, that if you read the whole textual unit, it's about certain measures. And the overall theme is, you husband and wife, if you're going to divorce, both of you behave, both of you do it gracefully, right? They take that word daraja and they link it to qiwama. So it becomes, and then we get circular arguments. Men are entitled to divorce because they have qiwama. They have qiwama because they're entitled to divorce. And then they use certain prophetic hadiths of many, and some of them also weak hadith, right? About women's moral inferiority, women's intellectual inferiority, and so on, right? And then we come to Muhammad Abdu, and we get another kind of patriarchal layer of meaning attached to this concept. And here we get sort of like this modern idea of domesticity. Women are meant for the home. You know, they are kind of like the queens of the home. The men are supposed to be the ones out there, you know, in the public sphere, conquering the public sphere and providing and protecting. But women inherently, you know, in their nature, they are domestic beings. And it's important to notice the differences in these different layers of patriarchal meanings that are attached to it. So what does this teach us, this kind of work? I think the importance of it is that, so when you hear in public debates, somehow how this concept has become so authoritative, people don't even need to explain it. Hey, khula is against judicial khula in Egypt, and now also in Jordan, is against men's qiwama. Sometimes they don't even need to explain it. Why has it become this concept that somehow right away, as a given, it's understood male authority, male superiority? I think this kind of study shows us how this came about. So that's an example of hermeneutics of deconstruction. And I'll show you now an example of hermeneutics of reconstruction, then I'll get into the societal engagement. If people have any questions, comments at this point? I'm not going to go through all 33 slides, don't worry. Right? Okay. Any comments? You let me know, or okay. So that was kind of like a hermeneutical critical reading, unpacking qiwama, i.e. qiwama is not God-given. It's as a concept, as a patriarchal concept, right? It comes from you know, an intellectual heritage of certain way of interpreting it over the centuries. But okay, but what's the alternative? What can we do? So this is a study. Earlier, Abu Bakr and myself, we studied all the divorce verses in the Quran, and we meant, and we're not the first one to invent that by all means. Also, our early scholars, some of them did that. It's a well-known approach, but what we call holistic thematic reading, right? And it's much more even common in modern tafsir. So what we did was, this builds on that study where we collected all the divorce verses and that tried to understand, can we revisit what the Quran has to say about it if we put them all together? But now this one, which we did with our colleague, the Moroccan scholar Asma Lambrabit, we collected all the verses in the Quran that have to do with marriage, with divorce, with parenting, right? And our question was, is there such thing as a holistic Quranic ethics of marriage? Is there such thing as that? And how can we understand it, right? And what does it tell us about Quran as a source of ethics? So this is what I mean by the first part of hermeneutics of reconstruction. Yes, it's about gender. Yes, it's about rereading marriage, divorce, and parenting. But also, can we go beyond that? What does it tell us also about Quranic ethics? Is there such thing as Quranic ethics? And then what are the implications for fiqh-based marriage, right? And so this is our methodology. So holistic, and by holistic, it means we also look at the unit of the verses. So yes, we are focusing on all the verses of marriage, divorce, parenting, all of them together. So it's thematic, but we're also looking at them in where they occur in the surah, in their chapter, and what does it have to do with before and after. So we're looking at the Quran holistically in that sense, right? So that's our premise, our hypothesis. And with intratextual, we mean, for example, where a certain term or a concept is mentioned in one text or a textual unit. And like, let's say, mithaq ghaliz, a solemn bond, which is used to describe marriage. It's also used to describe, for example, the relationship between God and prophets, mithaq. Is it relevant? Is it just random? Or, so that's what we mean by intertextual also, like nushuz, the nushuz of the wife with the nushuz of the husband, right? Which sometimes it's explained as marital discord or a certain kind of a transgression. It's been interpreted in different ways. But also, our premise is that this Quran, although it, of course, remember, it's a faith-based inquiry, so the assumption is this is a book that is not a book, but a revelation from the God, but it's also revealed in a very specific historical context, with particular history, with particular society, with particular norms, and it is addressing that society as well. It assumes that it's not only relevant to that society, so that's the historical part of it. And first and foremost, we were really, really interested in trying to systematically to understand ethical concepts. So when you have a unit of verses that somehow seems to suggest some kind of an injunction, by injunction I mean a Quranic ruling, a hukm or something like إذا طلقتم النساء, if you divorce women, or if it says الطلاق مرتان, divorce is twice. And there are certain concepts, ethical concepts, that the Quran repeats, ma'ruf, particularly in the verses that have to do with marriage, divorce, and parenting. Fadl, magnanimity, qist, not only, but particularly, qist, which is sometimes understood as fairness, interpreted as fairness, adl, justice, and so on. So we pay attention to what do they mean, these concepts? Do they play a role in the lawmaking? How do they speak to the legal part? What's the relationship between the ethical and the legal? And what we did was, so we studied this over a number of years, and then when we put them together, this is our argument. We say, yes, there's such thing as a Quranic ethics of marriage, and some of these verses, if we put all the verses that talk about marriage and divorce, actually set up for us certain ethical foundations, and that should be the starting point, but not only the starting point, but also the framework under which we understand specific rulings or injunctions for polygamy, for dower, for divorce, right? These have to be the guiding framework, and we envision them through our reading as three interconnected concentric circles of ethical foundation. So the first one is, and it's a very famous verse, a lot of Islamic feminism scholars talked about it, and not only Islamic feminist scholars, but others as well, which is the very first verse in the chapter that is named Women, An-Nisa. And it says, as you can see it here, so God is addressing all people, Ya ayyuhan nas, all people. And the key words are the mandate of taqwa, which is very hard to translate into English, actually. So some people translate it as fearing God, being aware of God, but it's more than that. It's really like living a life where God is present in what you do in every way. So it's really about enacting that kind of a moral life, right? So so it says all people are created from single soul, nafsin wahida, which is repeated in many places in the Quran. And then, so it emphasizes ontological equality, nafsin wahida, duality, zawjuha, pairs, plurality, and from it, many women and men and women, duality, plurality, and coming from one source, ontological equality, and again repeating the taqwa, the mandate of this moral agency for everybody, right? So we say and we say it's not haphazard that the chapter starts with that. That's the first one. And then the second one is one where it talks about certain things that have to do with reforming certain marriage practices that were happening back then, not inheriting women, not abusing them, and so on, not replacing one with the other, and abusing men. And then at the end, it says, because this is a solemn bond, a mithaqali. So we argue that that concept is foundational. It is spiritual, it is sexual, also physical, if you read the verse. And it is also intellectual. So, and we do that by also tracing how mithaq is used in other verses as well. Other verses, not just the ones relating to men and women. And our premise being that it is not random, right? If we approach this text as a text that has coherence, right? So that's the second one. And then the third one is in Surah Al-Rum, chapter 30, where it describes that the goal of marriage, the three pillars of marriage are resting abode, sakan, affection, mawadda, and compassion, rahmah. So we say this is how it should look like. This is the ethical foundation of marriage in the Quran, and theological. Because remember, the one about the ontological equality and living a life of taqwa is also a very much a theological issue. So the theology, ethics, and gender and law here are intertwined. So it's about ontological equality, affirming of duality and plurality. It's a solemn bond, and it rests on these three pillars. And we say that is not some verses we refer to it randomly here and then and forget about them. We say this is the foundation on which you build any other rulings, right? Okay, I think maybe, how am I doing? Shall I, how much more time so that, because I want to pick and choose and I can answer questions.
Yes, Doctor, it's been around 40 minutes.
Okay, so what yes,
you have
so what
more time.
So I will have another 20. So what I'll do is that I have other examples of hermeneutic of reconstruction by other scholars, for example, some that have to do with usul al-fiqh, and specifically this, how can we revisit the source of law, the four sources, the Quran, the Hadith, the Ijma' and the Qiyas, the analogy, right? By Naveen Rida, a scholar, an Egyptian-Canadian scholar based in the University of Toronto, and others. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to answer your questions, and I will share with you some chapters. But what I'll do is that I want to shift you to the societal engagement so that you get a sense, because if you recall, I said it's not only about knowledge, but it's also about societal engagement. That's the kind of Islamic feminism that I research and I also partake in. I'm a researcher of it, I'm a student of it, but I also partake in it. And we can talk about that dual role. Does it have tensions or not? That's something to be explored as well. So very quickly, but I want to show you also what regular women, no, I don't want to use that word regular, I keep saying it, lay women, what do they do? Okay, let me show you very quickly. One that I talked to for several years, I just call her Nifisa, that's not her real name. She works in the health sector. She's a university graduate. She's very much interested in her tradition, Islamic tradition. She tries to read, and she's not a part of any organized movement or anything like mosque movement, right? But she's engaged. She's very much engaged, right? So we were talking about how she got married, how did she arrange her marriage contract. Also, what I do when I talk to these women is I do life history interviews. So I'm interested in also how their relationship with their textual tradition changed, shifted from their childhood as they gotten older, and what brought that about. So she says And take a look at this. This is a quote directly from her. And it's also interesting how she is doing some kind of what the South African scholar, Sadia Sheikh, another important Islamic feminist scholar, calls tafsir of praxis. You know, praxis meaning lived reality practice. So she's saying, yeah, polygamy is in the Quran. I know it's in the Quran. So she's not trying to find another interpretation for that verse 4:3. She's not saying the Quran does not permit polygyny, but she's doing something else that is very interesting. She says, I cannot be a good Muslim if I accepted it. So what I see here, the way I analyze this is that she is has an understanding of a kind of like of a hierarchy of ethical commitments that are Quran based. One of them might permit polygyny, but there's another one that is higher for her. Yeah, if I want to be a pious Muslim, then not because it's my right and because I want to be in a monogamous marriage or because, but she ties it to her spiritual path, right? I won't accept it. So what she did was, in her marriage contract, she put a stipulation that she will not accept. She registered her marriage with the Finnish notary office, but she also concluded an Islamic marriage. And she put a stipulation saying, it's going to be a monogamous unit. So I'm interested in how she's doing this ethical reasoning, again, within the Quranic moral worldview, right? Right. So this is just an example. Now, I want to give you an example. So what are some of these societal engagements that some of these scholars are doing, right? So one example, which I get from Egypt, is with Umayma Abu Bakr, the scholar that I talked to you about. Another one who writes only in Arabic, whose work that I've also studied very systematically. And she leads this research center, kind of like, and called Al-Mar'a wal-Hadar, the woman and civilization. And Umayma Abu Bakr is the co-founder of Al-Mar'a wa Dhakira, Women and Marriage Forum. So what they've been engaging with, particularly since the 2011 Egyptian uprising, revolution, whatever you want to call it, they've been working with women's rights organizations, also with some religious institutions, to do gender-sensitive training of mosque imams, to popularize the academic knowledge that they produce to be used in first of arguments in order to push for a new comprehensive Egyptian personal status law. In Egypt, we call it personal status law, i.e. family law. And also to make the kind of arguments they use, the kind of language they produce in their scholarship, part of the public sphere. They've also worked with the Azhar on a position paper that the Azhar authored on women's rights. And there were tensions and challenges. So this kind of engagement, by the way, and they work very closely with these women's rights organizations to make this knowledge available and useful and relevant in a very direct way to reform the family law. But it doesn't mean it was all a success story. There are challenges, and I'm happy to tell you about it later on. But this is what I mean by the societal engagements, right? And in the Women and Memory Forum, they produce academic work, but also they produce that work in a public format that are accessible to non-specialist people. Okay, another country that does a lot, scholar activists who are traditionally trained Quran scholars, Hadith scholars, and work with what we call the religious boarding schools, Pesantren, is Indonesia, and where they established the World Congress of Islamic Feminism Scholars, men and women, where they issue fatwas, not only against child marriage and other issues related to gender, but also against environmental abuse, about extremism, so trying to link different kinds of social justices together and producing work in Bahasa Indonesian, but also working with other transnational actors. And one transnational group, network that I want to tell you about, and as a disclaimer, I am part of them, so I also work with them. We produce academic scholars together. We also do training. We also do a lot of constructive meetings and debates with religious scholars all over the world, in Morocco, in Palestine, in Egypt, and training of different people, university students, gender activists, and a lot of academic work, like actual research that takes several years, and then you produce peer-reviewed books. But not only that, also policy briefs, tracing the family law in different Muslim majority contexts, producing arguments that can be used for that. So different kinds of work that we do, and brings together these scholar activists from all over the world. Like there are Indonesians, Moroccans, from Britain, Iranian, British, American, Egyptian, of course, and definitely faith-based, right? And so this is some of the 2 books that we introduced. And this one took 7, sorry guys, women, men, all of you, sorry. So, and the way we do it is like, we adopt this holistic approach to the textual tradition. So we bring together, it's a collaborative research. We bring together scholars who have specialty expertise in different genres or religious branches, so, and we work on a certain question. Let's say here, the first one was about the Qawama and Wilaya, but we look at it not only in the Quran and the Tafsir, but also in Islamic law, in the social history of marriage and divorce before the nation state, in fatwas, pre-modern and modern, in Sufi treaties. So this integrated approach to the different textual genres of Islamic thought. And then the modern times, of course, the modern Islamic law, and our main approach also is we want the text to speak to the lived realities. So in every research project we do, there's a component that's ethnographic, where we go out, we actually do empirical research and interviews, spending time with people, life history interviews with women from different parts of the world. That's why it takes quite a few years. And the first one was more about it was kind of like a hermeneutics of deconstruction, like how did these Qawama and Wilaya become these patriarchal concepts that justify gender inequality? And how can we trace them in these different textual sciences, but also in modern laws, in fatwas, and in the lived realities? And the second one is, okay, can we explore ethical and legal models of egalitarian marriage from within the tradition that Islamically grounded? Is there such thing? And again, using an integrated approach, working on usul, on tafsir, and so on, right? Okay, I want to hear from you. So what I want to say is, what's the future? Basically, more of the same, I believe, in what I presented, because there's a lot to be done in what I presented. And although I think Islamic feminism is very promising, the way I understand it and research it, it has its gaps. Like I said, people don't produce with the same volume. Not everybody is systematically linking their scholarship with activism. Some are collectively doing things together, some are doing it individually. There's a big gap there's a dominance of certain languages like English, French, and the ones who write in Arabic, sometimes they are not known in the Western world, and that is a problem, so there's the dominance. But what I would say is, and this is hopefully where I can address the future, what's the future, is that and of course it has its gaps. In the book, I talk about the gaps in Islamic feminism, whether as scholarship and as activism, and what can we learn from these gaps. But what I would say is that within Islamic studies, and I locate it first and foremost as an inquiry, I think its relevance is that while it focuses on the gender question, it has a lot to offer in terms of understanding more systematically, more in a more insightful way, what is the relationship between ethics and law in the Quran specifically, and more generally, Islamic ethics. And this is a question, by the way, if you work on Islamic studies, that have been more and more recently very much an important question that a lot of people who have different approaches. Some of them adopt historical critical approach, some of them adopt other approaches, more traditionalist approach, whatever. But that is a question that's becoming, and people who don't even work on gender. What is the relationship between ethics and law in the Quran? How can we study it? What is the nature of the Quranic law? What is the nature of the Quranic ethics? And more broadly, what is Islamic ethics, right? And how can we, through the gender, understand the relationship between theology, ethics, and law? So this is where I see Islamic feminism going. Not leaving the gender question aside, but going further into those horizons that I see in the work of many scholars, you know, right? Whether it's the concept of Tawheed, whether it's, for example, Amani Saleh, who writes in Arabic, talks about the concept of Al-Haq, and how it means so many important things, theological and ethical things in the Quran, and it's one of the names of God, but how it's also a very important ethical theological framework, right? The work that Saadi Sheikh does on Sufism and the concept of amana, you know, and other Muslim philosophers talked about that. So that's one contribution I see Islamic feminists going to show that it's relevant beyond the question of gender, but not leaving the question of gender aside. The other side, the other thing that I see within Islamic studies is that this is a kind of inquiry, particularly the kind of Islamic feminism that I study, where it bridges, it kind of questions this divide that sometimes we see those of us who teach in universities or are researchers between lived Islam and textual Islam. So you find people who work on textual Islam, okay, I'm a textualist, and those who work on lived Islam as if they have nothing to do with each other. And I think Islamic feminism also is one kind of inquiry that can show us how the two can go together and what can they tell us. Within religious and gender studies, and this is something I've been doing for the past 5 years, is also comparative feminist theology, not particularly within the Abrahamic religion. So studying these same questions in Christian tradition, in Jewish tradition. And so one scholar who's a Muslim based in, who teaches in New York, and she did a lot of work on that. Maybe you know her work, Jerusha Rhodes. And it's about also how we can use the comparative approach, studying these different traditions, not necessarily to understand what is similar, what is different, where does patriarchy come from? No, but to come back to your own tradition, whether it's the tradition that you are an expert on, even if you're not a believer, but in this case, the tradition that you belong to, that you, and how can it help you by studying this, using this comparative approach and studying these other traditions in their own terms? How can it, when you come back to your tradition, how can it help you study it in a more fresh ways? And what do you compare, right? So this is something that I've been working on for a while, especially through my teaching. And I think it's a very, very important and rich area, again, that I can see the future of Islamic feminism taking there. And in the societal engagement, and this is the last thing, and I'll stop because I want to hear from you, then you'll have 1 hour, is, you know, some of the work that I've been leading and also taking part in some research projects, anthropological research project that looks about how different actors, whether they are the state or religious actors, are trying to reform marriage and divorce practices, particularly marriage practices in different Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries. One part of it through the law, but other parts of it through training people who are about to get married, what we call premarital couple training, awareness, and on social media, raising awareness. And this is being done in Egypt, and it's being done by, of course, sometimes women's rights organizations, but also more recently, and being done by religious institutions. Like, for example, in Egypt, it's being done by the Dar al-Ifta, you know, which is part of the Ministry of Awqaf, you know, so it's part of the government, but it's a religious institution, and done by the Azhar itself, training couples who are about to get married, right? The same was happening in Pakistan. We studied Egypt, Pakistan, I and a group of research team. And there it was led by women's rights organizations. also in Indonesia, led by scholar activists and the Ministry of Religious Affairs there in 2 regions in Indonesia. And when we studied these different ways of trying to reform how people, and all of these trainings, it's grounded very much in Islamic concepts, in Quranic terms. And what is common factor among them, which is very interesting, is foregrounding the question of ethics, al-akhlaq, right? And but also what we call manzuma al-akhlaqiyya al-Qur'aniyya, located in the Quran, you know, like but also then doing it also in modern terms. So sometimes in certain these training in Egypt, sometimes it also sounds like life coaching. So how marriage can be a path to spiritual growth, to more to grow your iman, you know, your faith. What does it mean really to be an ethical person, right? So there, I see a lot of focus on ethics, which is something that Islamic feminist scholars have been focusing on also, right? And other scholars who are working on Islamic studies. And I see this as an area where perhaps can be a space for constructive engagement with religious actors, with religious scholars, because there's no point in singing to the choir or just working with the people who believe the same way. But so I'm wondering if that could open the space for something. And of course, the question of ethics leads to other projects, you know, like ecofeminism, also to bioethics, which is being done now in by other scholars as well. Animal experimentation and the question of ethics and law, how is it relevant there? So the point is, I see the future also of Islamic feminism is how to make connections with these other kinds of reform projects on the societal level, led by religious actors, but also academic inquiries that are interested in the question of ethics and law. And let me stop here because I just don't want to talk at you and lecture, and I'm happy to elaborate, but let's have a real discussion. I'm also respectful of your time, and I'm sure you have thoughts, questions, pushbacks. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani. That was really interesting and inspiring talk today we had. And we have learned a lot from your lecture today. And I'm sure that the participants also joined the session of today and they will have some questions. Let's start with Sanjida. Sanjida, please go on.
Hi, Dr. Mulki. Thank you so much for your engaging and insightful lecture today. I really learned so much. I want to chip in a bit because I was reading Sabah Mahmood's Politics of Piety, and where she engages with practices like male guardianship, which she sees can be a form of ethical self cultivation and spiritual agency within the Islamic piety movement. So I was wondering how you were talking about restructuring, reconstructing, or reconceptualizing the notion of agency in the context of women's adherence to male guardianship within Islamic traditions, and what implications does this have for understanding feminist subjectivity in a non-liberal framework?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sanjida. And please call me Mulki.
Yeah.
And of course, I value very much the work of the late Sabah Mahmood. I had the privilege of meeting with her when I was working at the American University in Cairo, and she was here doing some her research for the second book. And we had very interesting and vibrant discussions together. May God bless her soul. And yes, I do agree with her on the in terms of her argument in the book. And please let me know if I haven't answered your question. That for me, I am with her on board in terms of agency doesn't mean liberation from the tradition. And I think her book makes a good and persuasive argument. in terms of some women's agency being very much how they come into who they are by cultivating and disciplining themselves, and and all the beauty of her work is also how she connects in a very organic way the theory and the practice, like how they cultivate who they are through this disciplining, drawing on the Foucauldian. Having said that, I think this is a different kind of project, Sanjida. This is a project where, first of all, I want to say and I have to be specific and the scholar activists that I study, they argue for gender equality. They do not, and they have very, and they're not all produce the same thing exactly, but broadly speaking, in Islamic feminism, at least the scholarship that I studied, of course, they write about and they understand equality not as formal equality, as we all know, right? But they are explicit about gender equality, gender justice, but their point is equality from within the tradition, equality and justice that can be substantiated in Islamic terms, but not only using methodologies of the past, but also, as I said, using theories from feminism, using literary approaches, modern literary approaches on how you read the text. But it's a faith-based. So what I would say is, and I've done a lot of work in Egypt as well. So I would say there's a space for the two. And often, I'm glad you brought this question, because sometimes one of the critics of Islamic feminism is that, are they kind of like inadvertently falling into the neoliberal trap? Are they just are they not being for example, Farid Ishaq wrote about that, and in fact he used Saba Mahmoud as an example and compared it to Amina Wadud and says, she's not being critical enough about the neoliberal project. Maybe she is inadvertently and not very critically reproducing neoliberal language, right? Someone else like Shuruk Naguib, and I write about that, says, well, the problem with also the and Farid Ishaq again, and you guys, i.e. Islamic feminist scholarship, you need to go there being the decolonial work, and I respond to that. But my point is, I would say, first of all, if we only take Saba Mahmoud's lens, then I think there's some kind of homogenization that is happening that doesn't speak to all women in Egypt and doesn't speak to all women, Muslim women in different parts of the world. That's number one. Number two, I would say, although some of this critique is also useful and we should learn from it, but I would say one gap that some of that critics have is they don't study these scholars very systematically. So like in Farid Ishaq, although he kind of like makes a similar point, right? And he says, well, Saba Mahmoud does that, but Wadud doesn't do that. Doesn't study all her work. Doesn't study how she develops. Doesn't study her in conversation with Kishi Ali, Ziba bin Husseini, Amani Saleh, Ulfa Yusuf. I think that's relevant. That's important because this is a project that's taking shape from the work of these different people. And maybe I haven't answered you satisfactorily, but I'm happy for you to get back, push back, and happy to hear from you again.
Thank you, Doctor. It was always about engaging and discussion. So it's that. Right. That's what matters. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Please call me Mulki. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, very nice. We have a question in the chat box. Do you have access to the chat box?
I do. But I wasn't looking at it. Let me look at it now.
Yeah. There are just two last messages are the questions.
Okay.
Of course, I encourage the students and participants to ask their question in voice if it's available for them, because it would be more engaging. And I know among you, there are some scholars, some already researchers, so it would be really nice to hear your voice. And I'm sure that if Mulki hears your voice, it would be more engaging. But if it's not possible, we can have the questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Right. Right, and I saw one. So the one says, okay, the dynamic between deconstruction and reconstruction, is there a similar dynamic in between demolition and construction within engagement and activism? Maybe, Julius, can you elaborate on the last part? Please excuse my ignorance. I need to learn more about what you mean by the last part of your question, demolition and construction within engagement, and so that I can hopefully address your question adequately. You can write or you can speak.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you. So you present, or you show like a dynamic where some approaches to maybe scholarship or hermetics work to, say, deconstruct like how certain ideas have come to exist, and then maybe reconstruct new ideas. And my question is about if you've witnessed or believe in some kind of similar dynamic existing in engagement, like in the world. Are there certain institutions that we should kind of look to see how they've come to exist, or maybe and is there like other organizations or that should be created, and perhaps even like, is there a relationship between like the dynamic in scholarship between deconstruction and reconstruction, and like the work we do in engagement?
Yeah. Thank you, Julius. And in fact, I think you are taking the question even in a broader and more nuanced level. Let me let's see. Let me explain first the deconstruction and the reconstruction part. So I will start from what I work on, and then try to perhaps share some preliminary thoughts about the latter part of your question. So the deconstruction, the works of these people is not very much so about doing away with the tradition. Some of them, and many of them, are very critical of the interpretive tradition. Some of them are also, say, for example, someone like Isha Ali would say the Quran has androcentric elements, you know, so it's not just about the exegetical corpus. The Quran itself is implicated in that patriarchy, right? So, but it's this kind of scholarship is not about breaking that tradition. You know, it's a deconstructing why, how, and why, as you said, certain concepts, not just ideas, but concepts, and also methodologies, a certain way of understanding the world through this text, a certain way of understanding human relationships, let's say, for example, within the family, and also between God and the human being. And so to unpack that, to say, okay, that is not, can we understand it in a more nuanced way? And also, can we unpack it? Can we, like the example I gave in the poem? Now, the reconstruction part is sometimes, so it has these two levels, so that sometimes, okay, can we explore an alternative concept, reading, right? And not everybody necessarily takes that all the way to the end, right? And some scholars even would say, well, I'm not here to give you the one and the only answer to this verse, like this verse should mean this, end of story. Not at all. But I think the other part of the reconstruction that is interesting, and I think is again having to do with methodology, with theology, with like the broader kind of like foundation. Again, if you want to look at the if you understand theological understandings and ethical understandings and concepts as like your building blocks through which you want to constitute a certain way of an Islamic understanding. So I'm trying to answer the question through these women and what I work on. Now, if we take what happens then in the social engagements, like how do they do that? Because they are socially engaged. they would say, and again, I want to be specific, but I'm happy for you to take this to another level and see how it applies to other things. It's like the family law reform. So some would say, for example, like it's about producing new language. It's about producing new ways of understanding. So so it would be about, like, there's a difference between Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia. Sharia is more, although Sharia is often understood and used as an Islamic law, but it's more like an ideal. But it's the fiqh, is this endeavor that each one of us and scholars are trying to understand, right? It's about, can we have this ethical way of living a Muslim life if it's done through the state? So some of them really focus their critique on the nation state, and so in that sense they are deconstructing. Though they say, but the running thread, the constant is all the time this attempt to reconstruct a certain Islamic worldview, right? But I don't know if and I'm happy to hear your thoughts. So I'd love for you to engage if we use these same concepts and kind of like approaches. So it wouldn't mean, for example, for them to, they wouldn't say, although some of them would say maybe we shouldn't have a fiqh-based law, not from a secular perspective. So would that be a demolition? Like, no, but they would say from an ethical perspective, Islamic ethical perspective, because you can't really have that kind of law that is administered through a centralized state machinery. So, so in that sense, are they demolishing an institution? You see what I mean? But then what do people or other people, how would they use these concepts? Then I would invite you perhaps maybe to chime in and take it further. Juliet, and please follow up if you want to.
But
you don't have to, but if you want to. Sorry, go ahead.
The only follow-up I have, and I don't want to take anyone else's time, is do you believe like demolishing institutions is necessary to achieving women's rights?
Okay, I would answer this question very specifically, and I'm answering it as myself being a researcher, but also a scholar activist who works with these people, right? I would say it is about demolishing certain ways of understanding the world. Yes, it is about demolishing and in fact decentralizing and maybe if you want to call it delegitimizing certain patriarchal concepts, right? But it is not doing away with the and it has to do with how we understand institutions. So for example, if we understand the institution as, let's say, I'll give you a very quick, very specific example again from my work, right? Fuqaha, jurists, religious institutions, the religious domain, the religious authority. It wouldn't be about demolishing them within this kind of project that I study and I work with, but it would be about democratizing it, including new voices, recognizing new forms of authority in it, but not doing away with it, not demolishing it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so there's another one. Don't you think that okay, please, I want to answer all your questions to the best of my ability. So please, is often relegated to the academic space. How does one make this knowledge accessible to Muslim communities, especially given the increased resistance to the concept of Islamic feminism? That's a very good question. And I will give you an anecdote, a real one, an example. So I was studying this kind of work in I think it was 2015, 2016. And there was this big conference organized by one of the Egyptian NGOs in the Mada Foundation. I have it in one of my slides, with the Azhar and many scholars from the Azhar institutions and Egyptian Islamic feminist scholars and religious scholars, men and women from different parts of the Arab world. And it was all in Arabic, and it was in Alexandria. And the focus of that NGO working with these Islamic feminist scholars was very much to create that space of conversation between Islamic feminist scholars and religious scholars, right? And I remember the first day there was a lot of talk about what is this, and in Arabic, Islamic feminist is an-Niswiyya al-Islamiyya, right? What is this is Niswiyya Islamiyya? And you got the usual arguments, you know, it's something important from the West. It's a foreign language. What is Niswiyya? Is it anti-religious? Is it right? And that was the first day, and we weren't getting much anywhere, you know. And there wasn't much dialogue happening. But it was a 3-day meetings. But afterwards, after we got beyond the terms and certain assumptions about how we understand them, what do they really mean? You know, that's why I say it's so important that people explicate how do they understand these terms. Then there was back and forth in these meetings. Now, was 2016. Now, we are 2025. If you read a lot of things in Egypt, right, and in other Arab worlds, right, and also Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia, even they have gone much further than us here being Arab-speaking world, right? Like if you study Indonesia, for example, right? There are much more familiarity and interest and curiosity and acceptance of the term and what it means and its relevance, and you see it in social media. So that is in relation to the pushback against it from the religious actors. But in terms of, is it for the elite? Yes, there is that critique. Is it just an academic work, right? And for the most part, or big part of it, it is. That's why I am interested in the kind that links scholars who are also very much engaged with religious actors, are doing different kinds of things in America, in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Morocco, that has to do with societal engagement. But partly that critique is true, that to the most part, it still remains within academic space. And the point is also how you popularize that knowledge. But because on the one hand, you need the theory, you need solid theoretical work, academic work, but how do you popularize it so that you can have a real conversation with practitioners, with lawyers, with mosque imams, with social workers, with now we have muftiyat, women jurists, and so on. I hope that answers the question, Bibi. Don't you think that exaggeration of criticism is nullifying the essence of Islamic feminism in aspect to its executive mode? MM, can you please explain your question? If you don't mind.
Also, Mulki, we have, okay, sorry. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, myself, Misbahul. Actually, madam, I want to take back the idea that whether the essence means too much that academic and non-academic perspective of blah 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 ism or blah 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 ism is just being nullifying out the idea of the true hermeneutics appeal of the Islamic feminism, which is being non-descriptive in ideas of the scriptures or non-scriptures mode. That's exactly my question.
But can you explain more, Ms. Bah? I'm sorry, I still don't follow. Can you maybe exemplify?
Yes. Actually means, ma'am, that like for the example of the deconstructive mode or reconstructive mode, we are sphering it out through the academic arena. And that's a large portion to outreach the Islamic feminism essence in large en masse. They are not getting the true idea of that ism in their own way of or approach of their practices. So it's being something, a kind of barrier which is happening out there from the academic perspective and the non-academic perspective.
So, Ms. Bah, is your question that what the non-academics and the academics are doing are kind of like detached? Is that your question?
Yes. Something like that way. You
Right.
can.
Okay.
Means it's a just a kind of, means I want to say that the Islamic feminism, as it's have a very beautiful essence in the um, Quranic scriptures or in other scriptural mode, but that's not been propagating in general mass. There is
Yes.
something, a kind of barrier happening out through the
Yes.
academic portions. We are only
Right.
means practicing, we are only working out with our API and something else. But while in the other part of the world, like for example in the African regions or in the South Asian regions or in the East Asian region, that essence of Islam is not being going out in proper mass, which is happening in the West in a very beautiful way. That's why it's a kind of a shuttle door for them.
Right. But yes, and let me share these thoughts with you. I hope they are relevant to your question, and if you're not, please by all means correct me.
No.
I mean, correct me if I'm not addressing your question. So the reason actually why I study women, and I've been focusing on women, yeah. But men are certainly important, but you can't do everything. But I'm particularly interested like in women, the scholars and the women who are not scholars. The reason why I focus on women who are not scholars, and not necessarily, I don't necessarily seek out women who are or part of an organized Islamicist Islamic movement, right? But women who are interested in the texts, right, in Islamic knowledge, but they are very much so because I'm interested in also the ways in which just this text is meaningful, is people try to get sense of it, people grapple with it, the textual tradition, I mean, by people here, I mean women, and specifically Muslim women, of course, in their daily lives, in their life experiences. So I've studied that a lot, and I do it purposefully. So because I think it's important also to look at that, how just people who are not scholars, people who are also not necessarily part of an activist movement, they are not part of a women's rights organizations, but they do care about the tradition, and they're not necessarily pious if in a formalistic way all the time. It's not necessarily like, oh, they are the ones who are all the time praying and fasting and and not doing and not breaking any the religious rules, but this tradition means something to them, and they grapple with it, and their relationship with it goes back and forth, and they are interested in understanding the tradition, right? So I think those kinds of people are important to study, because I am also into, and that's for me the non-academic part, and I'm interested in, okay, how do they read the Quran? What do they do with the Quran? I do a lot of work on that, and I've published it. How do they become mufassirat themselves, right? And through their life experiences. And what happens, for example, like how her relationship to a certain chapter in the Quran or a certain issue in the fiqh changes precisely at a certain juncture in her life trajectory, or after going through a certain experience, how she experiences nature or reading verses about the nature differently because of taking walks in the nature. I think that's important also, because that is a kind of hermeneutics from regular people that we need to understand. We need to understand. And the question is not to compare the two, but to create space for the two. Because also,
Yes,
yeah, anyway, yeah. I think
thanks a lot.
Amina wants to say something, and very quickly I'll answer Bibi's question. Yes, I'm of course familiar with Yasmin Wall's work, and I've cited her article. And this was an earlier article, an important article, where she critiques these scholars, and she was focusing on Sisters of Islam in Malaysia and saying, well, they're not fuqaha, they're not traditionally trained, and that's a very common. She's not alone. That's a very common critique. But also the critique of Islamic feminists, just like Islamic feminism itself, has really evolved and produced a lot in different languages. This was 2009. There's tons of stuff produced also. And the important thing also is to study and look at the things that are produced in different languages. You know, for example, Lena Siri, who you were with last year, has a good book where she looks at what Ulfa Yusuf does in Arabic and what Kesha Ali does in English, right? I would say it's partly not completely accurate critique, because it might it was a critique at a certain point. It doesn't address all the scholars, and also it kind of like homogenizes all of them. For example, the same thing Farid Ishaq does, like, you know, whom I value his work, of course, as the pioneer in Islamic liberation theology, but he has a couple of articles where he says Wadud wrote this, Sabah Mahmoud wrote that. Oh, this is what's wrong with Islamic feminism. And I say, in order to learn more from these critiques, it's gotta be systematic, and systematic in the sense of also study the evolution, study the differences between different scholars as well. So it's a common critique. It is partly true, but it's not the end of the story. That's what I mean. And when I say there's a lot that has evolved about Islamic feminism, and one critique also is like, and this about the thing about this critique also is, let's say I know the fiqh very well, and I'm very well versed in the traditional methodology of fiqh, and I read the text in their own languages, but I don't only use their methodologies, you know, because the question is not to come up with a new hukm, but to also to understand how they arrive at a certain hukm. So this critique a little bit also is trapped in that area. You know, do I have to be a faqiha in order to be legitimized? And by the way, some of these Islamic feminist scholars are traditionally also trained. So it's again, I think partly it also has to do with something that I raised in my last slide, and maybe to respond to one of your questions is not, I think it was with Julius about the institutions. It's also about democratizing the religious domain, expanding the religious domain, allowing new authoritative voices in the religious domain. And I think more, at least in that article, I love a lot of her work, her recent book. In that article, she's kind of reproducing that traditional understanding of religious authority. Only certain people with certain kinds of knowledge are the legitimate ones to talk about this. Amina, right? And let me know if I missed anyone. Please, Amina, go ahead. And Fatima says something, but maybe Amina, because your hand has been up for a long time, I apologize.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor Mulki. Thank you so much for your, and I must say that it was insightful, of course, but also very impactful, because for once, in your discussion around Islamic feminism was divorced from the advocacy and activism, you know, which I found very, very, very relevant and important. And you even coined a term called practical theology. So what I want to actually ask you is more related to your work, and where you have, you know, extensively examined the legal agency and the gender discourses around Qiyama and Khul. So I want to know that in your own research, you know, have you observed, or have you come across new discursive or institutional shifts, whether it's in the courtroom practices or the reform movements, that are actually rethinking and reconstructing, you know, the Qiyama and the women's legal agency? And, you know, especially your work, gender justice and legal reform in Egypt. So there is also this impression of one of the finding that there is a major disconnect between the legal text and the lived realities of women, and especially women from marginalized, you know, disadvantaged economic background, you know, trying to, or seeking full. So in what way at the grassroots level, or what sort of interventions are emerging, you know, to address these gaps or reconfigure, you know, these relationships between the law and the economic justice? You can just reflect a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Amina. Yes, of course, there are a lot of transnational, regional, and also local organizations led by lawyers, activists, but very much also working very closely with scholar activists. There are a lot more of them trying to, like I said, produce this knowledge and then speak very specifically, engage very specifically with religious scholars, with legislators, with policymakers, with change awareness. I gave you the example of Musawa, but there's also and that's a transnational, right? And it combines of people based in different countries and working together since 2009. And not only producing academic work, but very much also doing capacity building, policy briefs, mapping of these family laws, having these roundtables with judges. We've done that in Jordan, Palestine, Morocco, and religious scholars. And then there are people who are doing that on a national level, like in Indonesia, there's amazing work being done, working with these, the pesantren, the boarding schools, but also these, and they have these two big Islamic organizations, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyya, where they, so these scholars are, some of them are part of the Nahdlatul Ulama and the scholar activists, but they're working with grassroots people on the ground in different communities, and working on questions of producing fatwas that, and not just, they scholars coming in and telling them this is how you should read it, but actually working with these local communities and how you retrain religious scholars, but how also you revisit the question of why child marriage is not okay, and making these very systematic arguments, fiqh-based, social work. So there are these different works happening really. To what extent it's impactful? Some of its impact we can see on a local level. There are some things in Indonesia, for example, that have changed based on this work. Like some changes in the law. You could argue the Mudawana of Morocco is another example, right, where secular feminists and Islamic feminists came together, right? But of course, it wasn't only because of that. There were other political factors that led to it. So I think there's work being done. Now, is there large-scale impact? To what extent? The jury's out on that. But I think we can point to certain impacts, whether it's legal reform, whether it's like more direct engagement with local level. So even if you don't change the level of the law, you're able to work on the grassroots level with important people in the community, like the religious scholars, like the ones who are in so-called the de facto judges, and change how they implement law, Islamic family law. I think that's so there's really work out there, but has it become, kind of like more visible, more dominant? I think it's getting there. It is getting there, but it's uneven, the impact in different contexts, I would say. And now this question is, where do you think is the middle path that connect our traditional scholars with scholars of Islamic feminism? Yes, I think we should engage with them much more constructively, respectfully. I think, and we do that, by the way. I just attended a few days ago here in Egypt virtually. It was in person, but because of family issues, I attended online. There was this workshop, 2 days workshop on hadith and gender, the question of gender and hadith. And we had religious scholars from the Azhar. We had the scholars from different universities in Cairo and also Lebanon, Tunisia. And it was really important, and because there was constructive back and forth and disagreement and learning from one another. We need to do more of that. And one way of doing it is those who work on Islamic feminist scholars, they really need to do their homework. So, for example, there needs to be a lot more work in the relevant languages. You don't do this work, you don't talk to religious scholars in English. You go talk to them, depending on where you're working. In Indonesia, it's Bahasa Indonesian, but Arabic also, Arabic being important, right? So we need to do more of that language, more of that in Arabic, in these different local languages. but also to show people, these actors, that we know our stuff, we know the tradition, we know the methodologies, and not to be trapped, not to be hindered by the terms. So I'm more interested in dialogue happening. If it can happen without me using the term Islamic feminism, so be it. But the most important thing, can we rigorously, honestly, systematically address the question of gender inequality? You know, that's what I care about, and with a serious, rigorous engagement with the textual tradition, you know, and then we can call it whatever, you know. So it's also about knowing what language to use, right? And also, you know, another thing very quickly, sorry, is because to explore the common spaces, something that I said earlier in my presentation, but I'll say it again because it's important and it speaks to this language, to this question. Many people now, scholars in Islamic studies who are not religious scholars, but also religious scholars, from the research that I've done, right, that I told you about, like as part of a research team in Egypt, Pakistan, and Indonesia, there's more interest in the question of ethics, Islamic ethics, and not in an abstract term only, right? What does it say in the text? What does it, but also how can it be practical ethics? How can it be turned into something that really guides human relations, right? That is something that is also very relevant to Islamic feminism scholars. So we can start with these common questions. We have different methodologies, perhaps different focuses, but we have common questions where our different interests intersect. So I think that would be also a place where we can have more connection, I hope. Okay. Yes. Anything other? Did I leave any other questions? Let me see. Yes, Dita, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
First of all, thank you for presenting the lessons, which basically to me is putting the lay of the land of the Islamic feminism. Well, my question is probably a bit on a tangent. What I understand is that there's a lot of work to do in Islamic feminism, and also lots of challenges and pushback. And one of the challenges which I think is closely related to the gender relations is what I believe is duality of feminism, is a concept of masculinity in Islam. I found lately that many men and boys, particularly in social media, are now confused as to what it means to be masculine. And many still cling on the ill concept of masculinity, for example, like the warped concept of kiwama that you presented before. And obviously many blames this pushback to this warped masculinity on feminisms. So do you think that there should be a study or scholarships in Islamic masculinity, or is it part of Islamic feminisms, or what? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dita. This is so important. Very, very important. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, it is relevant to Islamic feminism. It is coming out in our ethnographic research, by the way. The research that we did in Pakistan and in Egypt and Indonesia, and the other fourth country was in Somaliland. Certainly coming out. And there are other people who've been working on Muslim masculinity, by the way. Absolutely relevant. Also and I'll just give you an example. You know, so we were, for example, sitting in and researching these premarital training that the Dar al-Azhar was giving to these couples about to get married. And one of the things that they were focusing on is re-understanding qiwama. And, you know, they were saying, well, qiwama is not about authority. And to be a man, it doesn't mean that you rule, that you boss her around, that she does the care work for you. But it's about mutual care. And the same thing was coming up in these premarital training that was happening in Indonesia, you know, and there focusing on masculinity, but from also the perspective of care work, that how you should both share care work out of a sense of Islamic piety, right? And then what happened was, and in Pakistan, the interesting thing we found was that we interviewed men also, right? And the men were telling us that they were burdened by the kind of manhood that they're supposed to present, to enact, to be the kind that is, first of all, you're not supposed to show any emotions to your wife, right? You're not supposed to be affectionate. You're not supposed to help her with the care work. And you know, and they gave us examples of certain languages used in Urdu, like you are seen like as if you're a slave to your wife. And interestingly, and the men were telling us, you know, that they were burdened, although they did not want to be that kind of a man. There's this expectation, and the expectation was coming from whom? Interestingly, from other men. So with peer, and the same thing came about in Egypt, by the way, that other men expect you to be like that, but also extended family, mothers and fathers. And in Pakistan, there's the practice of the couples living with their extended family as well, right? And some of the men whom we interviewed who took part in the premarital training in Egypt, you know, organized by Azhar, one of them was telling us, for example, like he started reflecting and he's saying, okay, what does it mean for me to be a man? Why do I feel like it's an affront to my manhood? You know, that somehow I need to know, you know, where my wife went. It doesn't mean that she just goes, and of course they're a couple and they live together and they coordinate with each other, but more like this sense of like it is my manhood is entangled in this sense of that I need to be in charge of her movement, right? And he was saying the same thing also. He had to grapple with it also in his relationship as an adult man with his mother, and he was starting to revisit that understanding of masculinity. So you are spot on. Certainly it's relevant. Certainly it's coming about in the ethnographic the findings of our ethnographic research. And the interesting thing, as I said, is how men are burdened by it, this kind of masculinity. But what are the obstacles, which is very interesting. Yeah. Why were there no Muslim women who challenged in early Muslim generations? But there were, by the way, Fatima, during the time of Tabari. Were they all submissive? Absolutely not. You know, we have very, very many examples. We have a very famous example. Some of you, I'm sure you know, for example, Salama, you know, one of the wives of Prophet Muhammad. You know, I mean, she used to advise Muhammad on very important political issues. There's Aisha and her as a jurist, but one of his other wives, of course, and who had these disagreement with Abu Huraira, a very important transmitter of the hadith, just like she is. You know, the infamous hadith where he says, you know, man, a woman and a donkey and invalidate your prayer. And she questioned him on it, and she took him to task. And this wasn't the only hadith, by the way, where she says, hey, Abu Huraira, you got it wrong. And in that hadith, she says, you liken us to that. And in fairness, and for the early muhaddithin, the scholars of hadith, they were patriarchal, of course. They were the product of their context, but they were, I would say, honest scholars. They recorded these debates for us in these. So when you look at the hadith books, you see these debates. So she challenged him, right? You know, there are hadiths where she challenges Prophet Muhammad on certain issues. And then you also have excellent historical work on the tarajim, i.e. the tabaqat, the biographical dictionaries, where we find lots of examples of women. These tabaqat, these biographical dictionaries were written by men, yes, but writing about women who were faqihat, jurists, muhaddithat, scholars of hadith, right? And the interesting thing is, you know, these scholars, some of them, like Suyuti, he was a mufassir, he was an exegete, and he also wrote these, and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, they wrote also these biographical dictionaries, and you would find them, when they write the tafsir, they would use very patriarchal language, right? And then, but when he would write these biographical dictionaries, he would describe these women as intellectually judicious, smart. They mentored other men, you know, and they were scholars. They were the teachers to other men. So thanks to these biographical dictionaries, we know. What we don't have, we have references to even books written by some of these women, but reference in these male authored books. But unfortunately, we don't have the books written by these women, right? We have some excerpts that attributed to them, reproduced in these men's authored books. So I would say certainly there were examples of women who challenged, right? And, you know, and the important thing about these women of the past is also that, particularly, for example, Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, you know, the mothers of the believers, the wives of the Prophet, like Aisha, of course, you know, they did not shy away from taking political positions, whether we disagree with it or not, depending on where you are, you know, and as well as disagreeing with certain political interpretations. That woman, the companion who challenged Umar ibn al-Khattab, you know, on the question of the dower, right? Whether he should specify it or not. Yeah. Okay. Have I missed anything else? What specific gaps do you see in the field of Islamic feminism? Yeah. There's a need for more volume, more in terms of amount of scholarship to be produced. I think there's a hegemony of work done in English, in French, and particularly English. There's a need to be more aware of very important work that's being done by scholars who also work in Bahasa Indonesian, in Arabic, in Farsi. And some of them, although they are familiar with some of them are familiar with the work being done in English and so on, but not the other way around, right? And part of it has to do with north-south inequalities, because the scholars based in the north, they have access to conferences, access to grants, access to their work being more visible, right? So that is a gap, definitely. And also the other gap is that not everybody, individual scholars, not all of them are equally productive, right? Some, you know, have written a lot and over a period of time, and you can see how they developed, how their arguments have changed, how they've been influenced by other scholars and so on, how they're in conversation with others. And some produced very few books that are important, but few, right? So I think that is certainly another gap. And I think also, you know, one critique, a recent critique, is that they, why don't they engage more with ilm kalam? And, you know, by an article written by a new, you know, a young upcoming scholar, Mahmoud Juma, where he is also studied them but criticizing them, and he says, oh, sometimes they draw on certain concepts from theology, like, for example, the nature of the Quran and so on. And he was specifically talking about Wadud and Asma Balus, but they don't really systematically go into kalam. And I think there's some truth to that. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say these are some of these gaps, certainly. Yeah. Okay. about neoliberalism? Is there any boundary where we Muslims should stop at so that we don't slip into others? I think it's important. I think that's a very important question, very, very important question, because this work can be co-opted and has been co-opted, right? Sometimes this work can be termed as, you know, the kind of Islam that can be swallowed in the West, you know, because it calls for gender equality and it wants to reclaim women's voices and the so-called moderate Islam. And as a researcher also, we want to be careful about what these categories mean and how they are co-opted. So it can be co-opted, definitely. You know, the kind of like, you know, like, yeah, they are the liberal Muslims, you know, and then what happens then is people, and usually these are people often in journalistic writings and sometimes even public thinkers. And then what happens is that they put different kinds of Muslim scholars that are very different, all in the same basket. Some of them who don't even believe in, you know, critiquing and providing alternative readings from within the tradition, which is intrinsic to Islamic feminist project, that it's from within the tradition. It's a critical engagement, but it locates itself within the tradition. So I've seen some writings where you put together people who are very clearly find that religion in all its forms is antithesis, is contrary to any you know, gender equality project, right? So so that is a very good question, and that is a valid concern, right? What we can do is that we all the time be clear, consistent about how do we understand it, how do we implement it, what do we mean by Islamic feminism, how do we use it, and what are we against as well, you know, and then to connect different social justice projects. So for example, to focus on the question of gender, but certainly not relegate or forget or ignore or marginalize how that is linked to neocolonial projects. Absolutely. Imperialist projects. Absolutely. So for example, someone like Lila Abu Luqad, her work, her project, you know, her book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? And although in one project, in one chapter, she criticizes Musawa, and I take issue with some of her critique, but some of her larger points are absolutely relevant, you know, like when this kind of work is co-opted to say, yeah, we're gonna save Afghani women. Are Afghani women now under the Taliban facing abuse? Absolutely, yes. Gender inequality, yes. That is true. We do not shy away from it. We call it what it is. But also, we are clear and critical about a kind of liberalist project that normalizes colonization and normalizes supremacy, normalizes also this kind of othering of Muslims and seeing Muslims always as objects of potential terrorists or barbaric, especially now more than ever when we live in a very dark times where we see these very dangerous civilizational language like us versus them, versus of civilization versus the barbarics. So yes, it can be co-opted, it has been co-opted, and one has to be aware and concerned and be consistent.
Okay, very nice. Dr. Mulki, we are done. And
okay,
yeah.
I hope I answered every questions at least, and I appreciate your attention, everybody, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Dr. Mulki, for sharing your time and your insight. It was really interesting for us and thought-provoking session. And as this is the last session and we're going to close this course, I would like to just take a moment to sincerely thank everyone who made this intensive course possible. And first and foremost, our deepest thanks, and this would be from all participants on behalf of them. This is a deepest thank to the professors who kindly accepted our invitation, and they shared their valuable knowledge and insights with us. And their contributions, Dr. Mulki, your contribution, it was truly enlightening and inspiring for us. And a warm thank to all the participants who joined us from different parts of the world. And I know that they have different time zone. And for some of them, it was really difficult to participate. And I know right now we have some participants from India, from Pakistan. In India, it's good to mention that it's now almost midnight, and they are joining us in this session. And it's really uh, interesting for us that this participants engagingly participate in this course, and they gave life to this course, and they made it a meaningful experience for all of us.
Yeah,
And
and
also,
wow,
yeah.
2:30 a.m. in Malaysia. Wow.
Yeah, yes, that's it. And the other thank would be to the coordinator, Muslim girl, especially Amani Al-Khatataba, and their team. They really helped us to make this course happen. And also the team members behind the course, they worked hard to ensure that everything ran smoothly. And this course, I want to say that was the result of a collective effort, and we feel truly blessed to have had such a wonderful community of learners and scholars, researchers from different countries. It was valuable for us. And they, all these scholars and researchers, they came together around this important conversation. And we hope to see you again in our future program. Thank you all once again, especially to the professors.
Thank you all for your interest. I really appreciate it. And if you want any of the readings, I purposefully did not give it to you, but I thought you just listen first. But I'm more than happy to share. So, and you have my email. I'm based at the University of Helsinki in Finland. By all means, reach out and communicate. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
And hope to
you.
see you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.